The Shadow of the Andes. Chapter 1. The Quiet Revolution. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Andes, casting long shadows over the capital city of Valdora. The streets, once bustling with the chaos of political protests and economic despair, were eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of rain and the faint hum of generators powering the few buildings that still had electricity. Valdora, the heart of the small South American nation of Erythra, had always been a city of contrasts, succulent mansions perched on hillsides overlooking sprawling slums, where the cries of street vendors mingled with the whispers of revolution. In the heart of the city, inside the crumbling Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Isabella Morales sat at her desk, her fingers drumming nervously on the polished wood. At 28, she was one of the youngest diplomats in Erythra's history, a position she had earned not through connections, but through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in her country's potential. Her dark eyes scanned the latest intelligence report, her brow furrowed in concentration. The world was changing. The United States, once the undisputed global superpower, had retreated into isolationism following the protracted Ukraine war. The conflict had drained America's resources and its people's patience, leaving a power vacuum that rival nations were eager to fill. China, Russia, and the European Union had turned their attention to the global south, where untapped resources and strategic alliances promised to reshape the balance of power. And Erythra, long overlooked due to its remote location and chronic political instability, had suddenly become a prize worth fighting for. Isabella leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The report detailed a recent visit by a Chinese delegation, offering billions in infrastructure investments in exchange for exclusive mining rights. The Russians had followed suit, promising military aid and technology transfers. Even the Europeans, usually cautious, had sent envoys to discuss trade agreements. It was as if the world had suddenly remembered Erythra existed. But Isabella knew better. This wasn't about Erythra's potential, it was about its vulnerability. The superpowers saw her country as a pawn in their game of global domination, a resource-rich backwater to be exploited and discarded. And if Erythra wasn't careful, it would be swallowed whole. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door.
"Come in,"
she called, straightening in her chair. The door creaked open, and Mateo Alvarez, her closest friend and colleague, stepped inside. His face was usually cheerful, but now grim, his dark hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it.
"You've seen the reports?"
he asked, his voice low. Isabella nodded.
"It's worse than we thought. They're circling like vultures."
Mateo sighed, sinking into the chair across from her.
"We need a plan, Isa. If we don't act soon, we'll be playing catch-up forever."
Isabella's gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of the city flickered like dying embers.
"We need leverage,"
she said quietly.
"something they can't ignore, something that makes us indispensable."
Mateo raised an eyebrow.
"And where do you propose we find that?"
Before Isabella could respond, her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen, a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words.
"Meet me at the old observatory, midnight. Come alone."
"You came?"
he said, his voice low and accented. Russian, Isabella guessed.
"Who are you?"
she demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray in her pocket.
The man smiled faintly. "A friend. Or at least someone who wants to be."
Isabella crossed her arms.
"I don't have time for games. What do you want?"
The man's smile faded.
"I have information. Information that could change everything for your country. But it comes at a price."
Isabella's heart raced.
"What kind of information?"
The man glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers.
"Not here."
He turned and led her into the observatory, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Isabella followed, her senses on high alert. The air inside was damp and musty, the walls lined with faded posters of constellations and planets. Finally, they reached a small room at the back of the building. The man flicked on a flashlight, illuminating a table covered with maps and documents. He picked up a folder and handed it to Isabella.
"Take a look,"
he said. Isabella opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. Her breath caught in her throat. The documents detailed the discovery of a massive deposit of rare earth minerals in the Andes, just outside Valdora. These minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to military technology, were worth billions, if not trillions, of dollars.
This can't be real.
She whispered. The man nodded.
It's real and it's yours, if you're willing to fight for it.
Isabella looked up at him, her mind racing.
Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?
The man's expression darkened.
Let's just say I have my reasons. But know this, if the wrong people find out about this, your country will be torn apart. You need to act fast.
The man leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper.
Form an alliance. But not with the superpowers, with the other overlooked nations. Create a coalition strong enough to resist their influence. Use this discovery to secure your independence before it's too late.
Isabella stared at him, her mind spinning. It was a bold plan, perhaps even impossible. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope.
Thank you,
she said quietly.
I'll do what I can.
The man nodded, his expression unreadable.
Good luck, Isabella Morales. You're going to need it. This changes everything,
he said.
But it also puts us in great danger. If the superpowers find out...
They already know.
Isabella interrupted.
Or they will soon. We need to act now.
Defense Minister Ruiz nodded.
She's right. We can't afford to wait, but we also can't afford to make the wrong move.
We need to form an alliance. Not with the superpowers, but with other nations like us. Countries that have been overlooked and exploited. Together we can resist their influence and secure our independence.
The room erupted into murmurs of agreement and dissent. Isabella's heart pounded as she waited for their decision. Finally, President Vega raised his hand, silencing the room.
Isabella,
he said, his voice firm.
You have our support. But this is your plan. You'll need to lead it.
Isabella nodded, a surge of determination coursing through her.
I won't let you down.
As the meeting adjourned, Isabella stepped out into the hallway, her mind racing. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The game had begun, and Isabella Morales was ready to play. Chapter 4: The Gathering Storm. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Isabella's shoulders as she stepped into the warm, humid morning of Valdora. The scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread wafted from the street vendors, an eerie contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface of her country. She had made a bold proposition to form an alliance with other overlooked nations, but the road ahead was far from clear. She needed allies, and she needed them fast. Isabella's first call was to Minister Javier Sarmiento of Gran Colombia, an influential figure in the Regional Economic Council. He was known for his pragmatic approach, a man who saw opportunities where others saw obstacles.
Isabella Morales,
he greeted her over the secure line.
It's been too long. To what do I owe this call?
She took a deep breath, measuring her words carefully.
Javier, what if I told you that the world's balance of power is about to shift, and that we have the chance to shape it instead of being crushed by it?
A long pause, then a soft chuckle.
You've piqued my interest. Tell me more.
By the time she hung up, a meeting was set. Javier would be in Valdora within 48 hours. But Isabella wasn't done. She spent the rest of the morning reaching out to envoys from neighboring countries, Córdoba, Altiplano, and even war-torn Amapá. Each call carried the same message.
Come to Valdora, we must talk.
Some were skeptical, others intrigued. A few outright refused. But by the afternoon, she had secured tentative agreements from 5 key nations. It was a start.
The first threat.
We have a problem,
he said, his voice low but urgent.
Tell me.
Matteo took a deep breath.
Our intelligence intercepted communications from the Russian consulate. They know about the mineral deposits.
Isabella's stomach clenched.
How much do they know?
Enough, he said grimly. And they're already moving. We believe they're planning to apply pressure, economically, diplomatically, maybe worse.
We're running out of time,
Isabella murmured.
Matteo leaned forward. Then we need to control the narrative before they do.
Isabella met his gaze and nodded.
Then we go public, on our terms.
A nation's secret, revealed by nightfall, the government of Erythrea prepared to make history. At exactly 8 p.m., President Vega sat before the cameras, Isabella standing just behind him, her face unreadable.
My fellow Erythrians,
he began, his voice calm yet firm.
Our nation stands at the precipice of a new future.
He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle.
For too long, our country has been treated as a footnote in the pages of history. But today we take our destiny into our own hands.
The camera zoomed in slightly as he continued. Scientists and geologists have confirmed what may be the most significant discovery in our nation's history, a vast, untapped deposit of rare earth minerals, essential to the global economy. Gasps rippled through the press pool. The world had just changed. And Isabella knew some would see this as a moment of triumph, others would see it as a declaration of war. Chapter 5. Lines in the Sand. The broadcast had barely finished when the storm began. International news outlets erupted with speculation. Financial markets reacted with cautious optimism, and foreign leaders scrambled to issue statements. Some hailed Erythra's discovery as a breakthrough for the global south. Others saw it as a disruption to the delicate balance of power. By midnight, the first wave of diplomatic calls had begun. The Chinese ambassador requested an urgent meeting. The Russian trade envoy extended an invitation for strategic discussions. Even the Americans, who had distanced themselves from the region for years, sent a formal message of interest. But it wasn't just governments reacting. As Isabella and Matteo monitored the situation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a call came in from their intelligence liaison. "We have credible threats," the agent reported. "Cyber attacks against government infrastructure have already begun. We've also detected unusual activity near the mining regions, drones, unmarked vehicles."
Matteo clenched his jaw. Who's behind it?
The agent admitted. "But our best guess?
Foreign operatives or corporate interests who want control over the deposits before we can secure them."
Isabella exhaled sharply. It was never going to be easy.
Then what do?
We don't blink, we move first.
You've set the world on fire,
he mused.
Now let's see if you can control the flames. She's not backing down,
the Russian muttered.
And worse, she's rallying others.
The man in Zurich smiled thinly.
Then we ensure she has no one left to rally.
A wire transfer was executed, and somewhere in Valdora, a hired assassin received their next target.
We're in agreement then?
The representatives from Córdoba and Altiplano exchanged glances before nodding.
Yes, we commit to the coalition, but we need guarantees. What happens when the superpowers retaliate?
Isabella kept her expression calm, though she felt the weight of their concern.
That's why we act fast, before they can isolate any one of us. We present a united front to the world, an economic alliance of emerging nations, one that controls strategic resources and refuses to be puppets.
Javier smirked.
Ambitious.
Matteo, seated beside Isabella, checked his phone and frowned.
Isabella a moment?
She excused herself and followed him into the hallway.
What is it?
Matteo took a deep breath.
Our security team picked up an anomaly. Someone loitering near the ministry.
She stiffened.
You think it's related?
Matteo's jaw tensed.
I think you need to be careful. Are you hit?
She shook her head, adrenaline making her limbs tremble.
Who sent them?
One of the agents crouched by the body, pulling a sleek phone from the assassin's pocket. He scanned the screen, then looked up grimly.
There's a message, Russian. It says if she breathes, we failed.
A cold silence settled over them. They had expected threats, but now it was war. Chapter 7. No More Shadows. The body was barely cold before Isabella was ushered into a reinforced government convoy, Matteo at her side. Sirens wailed through Valdora as the security forces swept the streets, searching for any loose ends from the assassination attempt. Isabella sat stiffly, her mind racing. This wasn't just a message. It was a declaration.
They don't want negotiations,
she murmured.
They want obedience.
Matteo, rubbing his temple, exhaled sharply.
And they're willing to kill to get it.
The armored vehicle rolled through the darkened city, heading toward the presidential palace. The coalition's representatives had been moved to a secure wing, their expressions a mixture of shock and steel when Isabella stepped inside. Javier Sarmiento was the first to speak.
I take it that wasn't a random mugging.
No,
Isabella said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. And it won't be the last.
The room fell into uneasy silence.
Then let's stop pretending,
Javier said.
We've stepped into a battlefield. The superpowers won't let us rise without a fight.
Isabella met his gaze.
Then we don't just defend, we push back.
The offensive begins. By sunrise, the coalition's first countermeasure was in motion. Erythra and its allies issued a joint declaration, officially forming the Andes Accord, an economic and security pact aimed at leveraging their collective resources against external influence. The agreement was simple. Any foreign power seeking to negotiate had to do so with the Accord, not with individual nations. The response was immediate. China requested an emergency summit. The Russians issued a cold but measured statement. The European Union expressed concern, but extended an invitation for discussions. And then there were the Americans. Unlike the others, Washington remained silent. That silence was unsettling. A visit from the past. 2 days later, Isabella received an unexpected visitor. A tall man, American by the way he carried himself, arrived at the ministry. His suit was expensive, his gaze unreadable. He introduced himself with a simple name, Mr. Carter.
"We should talk?"
He said, his voice devoid of emotion. Isabella led him into her office, aware of Matteo hovering nearby. Mr. Carter sat across from her, unbuttoning his jacket.
"You've been making waves, Miss Morales."
She folded her hands on the desk.
I take it your government has an opinion on that.
A small smile.
"We always have opinions, but more importantly, we have concerns."
Such as?
He leaned forward slightly. "You've just upended decades of geopolitical strategy. You think the U.S. will ignore that?"
Isabella refused to flinch. We're not here to be ignored, we're here to be respected.
Mr. Carter studied her for a long moment before nodding.
"Then let's talk about respect. Because if you make the wrong move, Isabella, you won't get another chance."
Her breath slowed. This wasn't just a warning, it was a test. And Isabella Morales had no intention of failing. Chapter 8, Playing with Giants. Isabella leaned back in her chair, forcing herself to hold Mr. Carter's gaze. The American envoy radiated the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades maneuvering in rooms where nations were shaped and dismantled.
She refused to let him see her hesitate. "If this is a threat," she said, voice then Yushivan, "I don't respond well to them."
Carter chuckled, the sound dry and knowing.
"Not a threat, Miss Morales, a reality check."
He folded his hands together.
"The Andes Accord is an impressive move, but do you truly understand what you're inviting?"
Isabella arched an eyebrow. "I understand that for the first time our nations have leverage. And I understand that your government doesn't like that."
His smile never faded, but his tone cooled.
"America doesn't like instability, and right now you're creating a lot of it."
Matteo, standing by the door, scoffed.
"Instability? That's rich coming from you."
Carter ignored him.
"I'm here to offer an alternative to open confrontation."
"Then speak plainly,"
Isabella said. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a single folder.
"A counteroffer, trade partnerships, investment into your infrastructure and military assistance, should you need it."
Isabella tapped her fingers against her desk, and in return?
He exhaled slowly. "Access, not just to your resources, but to your political direction. We want a seat at the table, Isabella, before someone else takes it."
There it was. Not an attempt to crush them outright, at least, not yet. But an attempt to buy them, to make Erythra and the Andes Accord a dependent, rather than a power in its own right.
She met his gaze, considering her next move.
A dangerous game. 2 hours later, Isabella and Matteo sat alone in her office, the folder lying untouched between them.
"He's not wrong,"
Matteo admitted.
"If we push too hard, we might not survive the response."
Isabella tapped the desk, deep in thought. They expected us to accept without question. They think we're desperate.
"Aren't we?"
She smirked. Desperate doesn't mean foolish.
Matteo leaned forward. "What are you thinking?"
She picked up the folder, flipping it open. We give them just enough to keep them guessing. We negotiate, but on our terms. And we use this to buy time.
"Time for what?"
Her eyes burned with determination. To turn the Andes Accord into something they can't ignore.
The summit. 3 days later, the world turned its attention to Valdora as the leaders of the Andes Accord gathered for a historic summit. Cameras flashed as presidents, ministers, and diplomats stepped into the grand hall, their expressions a mixture of cautious hope and steeled resolve. Journalists swarmed, asking the same questions over and over. What is the true goal of the Accord? Are you forming an anti-superpower bloc? Is war on the horizon?
Isabella ignored the noise.
Inside the private chamber, where only the true decision-makers sat, the real conversation began. Javier Sarmiento stood.
"We all know why we're here. The world is trying to divide us either by force or by persuasion. The question is, do we hold the line?"
Then, Altiplano's representative nodded. Cordoba's minister followed.
"We hold."
One by one, the voices rose. Then they turned to Isabella.
She stood, her voice clear. "Then it's time to give the world our answer."
Chapter 9, A New Order. The summit's declaration sent shockwaves through the international community. The Andes Accord was no longer just an economic alliance. It was now a strategic bloc committed to mutual defense, resource control, and independent policymaking. The world's response was immediate. The superpowers react. Within hours, statements poured in. The United States issued a carefully worded warning.
We respect the sovereignty of all nations, but urge the Andes Accord to consider the importance of global cooperation.
China offered a more measured approach.
China welcomes the economic development of the region and looks forward to mutually beneficial partnerships.
Russia was blunt.
Eritrea and its allies should remember who their true friends are.
And behind closed doors, the gloves were coming off. Economic warfare begins. Within 24 hours, the global markets reacted. Investors pulled out of Eritrea's industries, sending its stock index tumbling. Sanctions were quietly discussed in Washington and Brussels. Supply chain disruptions targeted key exports from the Andes Accord nations. It was financial warfare, designed to pressure them into submission without a single bullet being fired.
Isabella expected this. She had prepared for it.
At an emergency meeting of the Accord, she addressed the leaders.
They want us to panic,
She said.
They want us to fold before we even begin. But we have leverage.
She turned to Javier Sarmiento, who nodded.
We control the minerals they need.
Cordoba's minister added. Altiplano's delegate smirked.
So we use their own game against them.
The countermove. That night, the Andes Accord made its next move. They announced a temporary export freeze on rare earth minerals, effective immediately. The impact was felt worldwide. Tech companies panicked. Without these minerals, production of semiconductors, batteries, and critical electronics would slow to a crawl. Defense contractors raised alarms. These minerals were essential for military hardware. Market analysts called it a crisis. Prices skyrocketed overnight. Suddenly, the superpowers weren't just looking at a rebellious bloc. They were looking at a threat to their supply chains. The knife's edge. 2 days later, another message arrived at Isabella's desk. A single line.
Negotiate or suffer the consequences.
Mateo read over her shoulder.
They're done playing.
Isabella exhaled, steeling herself. So are we. She turned to her advisors. Schedule the meeting.
With who?
She met his gaze. All of them.
The world was coming to Valdora, and this time, Eritrea wouldn't be asking for a seat at the table. They would be setting the terms. Chapter 10. The Summit of Giants. Valdora had never seen anything like it. The world's most powerful figures, presidents, ministers, and corporate elites, descended upon the capital of Eritrea. The city was locked down under the heaviest security in its history. Snipers watched from rooftops. Armored convoys rumbled through the streets. Every intelligence agency had an eye on what was about to unfold. Inside the presidential palace, Isabella stood before a polished mahogany table where the fate of her country, and possibly the world, would be decided. On one side sat the Andes Accord, a coalition of nations once dismissed as insignificant. Now, they controlled the most valuable minerals on the planet. On the other side, the superpowers, China, the United States, the European Union, and Russia, each sending their best negotiators, each determined to regain control. Silence settled over the room. Then, the American Secretary of State leaned forward, breaking the tension.
Let's get to the point.
A battle of words. For the next 6 hours, negotiations raged. The United States offered financial incentives, promising to invest in the Andes Accord's development in exchange for a steady mineral supply. Isabella saw through it. It was an attempt to buy control. China proposed a long-term trade agreement, but with conditions that would make the accord dependent on Chinese infrastructure and technology. Another power play. The European Union took a softer approach, offering diplomatic partnerships and trade without military interference. Tempting, but not enough. And Russia, they made no offer, only a warning.
You cannot stand against the world forever.
Their envoy said. Javier Sarmiento smirked.
We don't need to stand against the world, just against those who would take from us.
The Russian scowled.
Then you force our hand.
Silence, Isabella finally spoke. You all misunderstand something, she said, her voice calm but firm. We are not here to beg. We are here to decide who is worth doing business with. The room stiffened. The balance of power had shifted, and the superpowers knew it. The New Deal. By midnight, an agreement was reached. One, the Andes Accord would maintain full control over its resources. No foreign power would dictate how minerals were extracted or traded. 2. Supply contracts would be negotiated individually. No one country would get a monopoly. 3. No military interference. Any violation of sovereignty would be considered an act of aggression. It was a historic victory.
Isabella knew they hadn't won the war, only a battle. The superpowers would try again through new methods, new pressures.
But tonight, the Andes Accord had forced the world to acknowledge them. As she stepped onto the balcony, overlooking the city, Matteo joined her.
You did it?
He said.
She exhaled. We did it.
But as the celebration began below, Isabella knew one truth. The real fight was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Cost of Victory. The celebrations in Valdora lasted until dawn. Crowds flooded the streets, waving the flags of the Andes Accord, cheering for a future that no longer felt dictated by distant powers.
But Isabella Morales couldn't afford to celebrate.
She sat in a dimly lit conference room, surrounded by maps, reports, and intercepted intelligence briefings. The superpowers had accepted the Accord's terms, but acceptance was not the same as surrender. Matteo placed a fresh document in front of her.
You need to see this.
She scanned the page. Classified economic reports, internal memos, communications intercepted from multinational corporations.
Her blood ran cold.
The war had simply shifted. A new kind of attack. The Americans were funneling billions into stabilization initiatives, propping up opposition parties within Accord nations. China was moving to undercut the Accord's influence by brokering deals with unaffiliated South American countries. Russia had begun military drills alarmingly close to Erythraean waters. European investors were suddenly pouring money into select factions, attempting to create divisions within the Accord. The message was clear.
If they couldn't control the Andes Accord from the outside, they would try to break it from within.
Isabella tossed the folder onto the table.
They're already trying to unravel us.
Javier Sarmiento, sipping his coffee, gave a dry laugh.
Did you expect anything else?
Holding the line, the next phase of the battle wasn't about open confrontation. It was about influence. Isabella quickly organized an emergency Accord summit. Behind closed doors, she laid out the situation.
This isn't over.
She told them.
They will use everything, economic pressure, political manipulation, media campaigns, to turn us against each other.
Cordoba's minister nodded grimly.
Then we stay ahead of them.
The counterattack. The Andes Accord's response was swift. The world had underestimated them before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. A target on her back. Late that night, as Isabella finally returned to her office, exhaustion pressing down on her, she noticed a single envelope on her desk. No return address, no markings, just her name. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, a grainy, long-lens shot of her meeting with the coalition leaders. And beneath it, a note.
You are playing a dangerous game, Miss Morales. Be careful not to lose.
Isabella's grip tightened. She had known the risks when she started this. But now it was personal. Chapter 12. The First Crack. The note sat on Isabella's desk like a live grenade. It wasn't just a warning, it was a reminder. The world had eyes on her, waiting for her to slip, waiting for the Andes Accord to fracture under the weight of pressure.
She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Who had sent it?
The Americans had a vested interest in keeping her wary. The Russians weren't subtle enough for veiled threats. The Chinese preferred leverage, not intimidation. The Europeans played the long game. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to scare her. They were testing her resolve. Political fire. Before she could dwell on it, a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Matteo entered, his face tense.
We have a problem.
She barely had the energy to smirk.
Just one?
He dropped a folder onto her desk.
Cordoba, they're getting cold feet.
Isabella flipped through the documents. Leaked diplomatic cables. Political donors with outside interests. Media campaigns stoking division. Someone was working inside the Andes Accord. She met Matteo's gaze.
They're trying to break us apart.
He nodded grimly.
And it's working.
The power struggle. By morning, Cordoba's president had issued a statement of reassessment regarding the Andes Accord. It wasn't a withdrawal, but it was the first crack. News agencies latched onto the uncertainty, fueling headlines. Is the Andes Accord already falling apart? Erythraea's gamble, too bold, too soon. Superpowers regain control as Accord faces internal strife. It was exactly what their enemies wanted. Isabella needed to act fast. A meeting in the dark. That night she met with Javier Sarmiento in a secluded villa outside Valdora. No staff, no phones, no reporters. He poured himself a glass of whiskey.
It's starting.
She leaned against the table.
We need Cordoba to hold the line.
Javier swirled his drink.
They're scared. They don't want to be the first domino.
She knew what he meant. If one nation left, the rest would hesitate. The accord would collapse. She exhaled.
Then we give them a reason to stay.
Raising the stakes, by dawn, Isabella made a bold move. She announced that Erythra would double its rare earth mineral exports to Cordoba, ensuring their economy remained stable, but only if they reaffirmed their commitment to the accord. It was a political gamble. If Cordoba rejected the offer, it would expose them as being influenced by external forces. If they accepted, it would strengthen the accord's unity. Within hours, the pressure mounted, and finally, Cordoba's president stood before the cameras and reaffirmed their alliance. The first crack had almost broken them, but now the accord was stronger than ever. The next move. Isabella knew this wouldn't be the last attack. She had won this round, but somewhere, in some foreign capital, another plan was already in motion. The question wasn't if they would strike again. It was how soon, and whether she would be ready. Chapter 13. The Shadow War. The Andes Accord had survived its first internal crisis, but Isabella knew that was only the beginning. The superpowers weren't retreating, they were adapting. The next attack wouldn't be political. It would be something much harder to control. A warning from the underground. 2 days after Cordoba reaffirmed its allegiance, Matteo burst into Isabella's office, his expression unreadable.
We have a visitor.
Isabella frowned.
Who?
Matteo hesitated.
You won't like it.
A few minutes later, a hooded man was escorted into a private meeting room. His presence was unsettling, but Isabella recognized his type immediately. A fixer, a broker of secrets, and he had come directly to her. He pulled back his hood, revealing sharp features and piercing dark eyes. His Spanish had a slight Russian lilt.
You're in danger, Senora Morales.
She leaned back.
That's not news.
He smirked.
No.
He slid a USB drive across the table. Isabella picked it up cautiously.
What's on this?
His face darkened.
Proof that someone is planning to sabotage Erythra's energy grid. A cyber attack, designed to shut down your infrastructure. And when the lights go out, your people will turn against you.
Matteo cursed under his breath.
Who's behind it?
The man didn't answer directly.
The kind of people who don't like it when small nations start thinking for themselves.
Race against the clock. Isabella wasted no time. Within hours, Erythra's cybersecurity teams were working around the clock to fortify their networks. Firewalls were reinforced, servers isolated, backups secured, but the attack was already in motion. The next evening, at exactly 9:37 p.m., a citywide blackout plunged half of Valdora into darkness. Traffic stopped, communications flickered, panic spread. The news reported it as a technical failure. But Isabella knew better. This was the opening shot of a new kind of war. Fighting back. By midnight, emergency power was restored, but the message had been sent. Somewhere, in an office in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, someone was watching. They were testing Erythra, pushing its limits. Matteo's voice was quiet.
They want to break public confidence. Make people doubt that we can handle independence.
Isabella nodded, eyes hard.
Then we show them what real independence looks like.
The next morning, she held a press conference. Live, on every news network, she did something unexpected. She revealed the cyber attack. She called it what it was. Foreign interference. An act of war against a sovereign nation. The world wasn't expecting that. Governments scrambled to deny involvement. Analysts speculated. But the people of Erythra, they rallied behind her. The superpowers had tried to turn her people against her. Instead, they had made her stronger. And as Isabella stood before the cameras, she made a final, chilling statement.
To those who believe they can control us from the shadows, know this: you are no longer hidden. We see you, and we are ready.
The war had officially begun. Chapter 14, The War in the Light. The press conference changed everything. Isabella's decision to expose the cyber attack turned a hidden battle into a global spectacle. Governments scrambled to issue denials. Intelligence agencies were forced into damage control, and the world's media exploded with headlines. Erythra accuses superpowers of cyber warfare. Is this the start of a digital Cold War? The Andes Accord strikes back, a new global order emerging. Who attacked Erythra? Nations point fingers, but no one claims responsibility. Divide and conquer. By dragging the attack into the light, Isabella had done something crucial. She had forced the superpowers to turn on each other. The United States issued a strong denial, accusing other actors of attempting to destabilize South America. China remained silent, a clear sign that they were either involved or waiting to exploit the situation. Russia was openly furious, calling the accusations Western propaganda, which meant they were trying to distance themselves from blame. The cracks were showing, and Isabella planned to widen them. The next move. That night, she gathered with Javier Sarmiento and the rest of the Andes Accord leaders.
They expected us to be defensive,
She said.
Instead, we go on the offensive.
Javier smirked.
You have a plan.
She nodded.
We turn this into an opportunity.
The global summit gamble. Within 24 hours, the Andes Accord announced something that sent shockwaves through the diplomatic world. A global summit in Valdora, inviting every nation, including the superpowers, to sit at the table publicly and discuss the future of trade, security, and global cooperation. It was a brilliant trap. If the superpowers refused to attend, it would make them look like the aggressors. If they accepted, they would have to negotiate on Erythra's terms in front of the entire world. The response. The invitations went out. The European Union responded first, agreeing to send representatives, though cautiously. China waited a full 48 hours before confirming their attendance, a sign they were calculating their next move. Russia? Silence. No official response, but intelligence reports confirmed that they were furious behind closed doors. And the United States. They sent back a short message.
We will attend, but understand, Miss Morales, you are playing with fire.
Isabella read the words and smiled. Good. She was ready. Chapter 15. The Gathering Storm. The world was coming to Valdora. For the first time in history, leaders from the Andes Accord, the United States, China, Russia, and the European Union would sit at the same table, under the eyes of the global press. The stakes couldn't be higher. Security in the capital was unprecedented. Military checkpoints, no-fly zones, armed patrols. Every intelligence agency had its eyes on Erythra, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Inside the ministry, Isabella reviewed final preparations with Matteo and Javier.
They're not coming to negotiate.
Matteo muttered.
They're coming to see if they can break us.
Javier smirked.
Let them try.
Isabella closed the dossier in front of her.
We don't play defense, we dictate the terms.
The summit of Valdora would decide everything. The arrival of giants. The city came to a standstill as the convoys arrived. The Americans landed first. Their delegation, led by Secretary of State Alan Carter, was flanked by elite security. His presence alone sent a message. The US still considered itself the dominant power. China's delegation arrived next. Their foreign minister, Chen Wei, was a strategic mastermind known for long games and quiet moves. The Europeans were cautious, neutral, waiting to see where the tide would turn. Russia arrived last with an ominous silence. No press statements, no diplomacy, just cold stares. And at the head of it all, Isabella Morales, the woman who had forced them all to be here. A silent battle begins. The opening session was polite on the surface, but beneath the scripted speeches and handshakes, the real war was already happening. Every phrase was measured, every look calculated. The superpowers wanted the Andes Accord divided. They wanted concessions, but Isabella had spent months preparing for this moment. She leaned forward, her voice steady.
This is not about the past, it's about the future. We are here to define a world where smaller nations are no longer stepping stones for greater powers.
A flicker of tension across Carter's face. A slight shift in Chen Wei's expression. They knew what she was doing. We have traced the financial origins of this attack to outside forces, and we will not allow them to destabilize us. It was a diplomatic bombshell. The superpowers had spent decades operating in secrecy, manipulating, destabilizing, controlling. Now, they had been caught in the act. The fallout within hours, the global response was chaos. The US State Department issued a strong denial, calling the accusations unfounded. Russia lashed out, accusing Isabella of fabricating a crisis. China remained silent, a sign that they were recalculating. The European Union? They issued a cautious statement calling for investigations, but it was clear they knew Isabella wasn't bluffing. The battle had shifted. The superpowers were no longer in control of the narrative. Now, they were on the defensive. And Isabella Morales? She was proving that the Andes Accord would not break. Chapter 17. The Counterstrike. Isabella had done the unthinkable. She had exposed the hidden hands manipulating the Andes Accord. The world was watching, and the superpowers were scrambling. The private meetings begin. The morning after her bombshell press conference, Isabella's schedule was packed with urgent closed-door meetings. First, it was the Europeans. Their delegation leader, a seasoned diplomat from Brussels, leaned forward.
You've forced everyone to acknowledge the game, but now you've also forced escalation.
We didn't escalate.
Isabella said calmly.
We just turned the lights on.
Then came the Americans. Secretary of State Alan Carter sat across from her, his expression unreadable.
You're playing a very dangerous game, Isabella.
Only because people like you have been dealing from a stacked deck.
Carter exhaled.
We don't want conflict.
Then stop treating us like pawns.
Isabella countered.
We're done being controlled at...
For the first time, Carter looked uncertain. Russia makes its move that evening. A private intelligence report landed on Isabella's desk. Russia was mobilizing military assets near Erythra's borders. Not an invasion yet, but enough to send a message. Javier, reading over her shoulder, cursed.
They're seeing how far they can push us.
Then let's push back.
The strategic response. Within hours, the Andes Accord issued a joint military declaration. Any unauthorized military action against an Accord nation would be considered an act of war. The world held its breath. Would Russia back down, or would they call the bluff? Then, something unexpected happened. China breaks the silence. For days, Beijing had remained quiet, watching the crisis unfold. But then, in a rare diplomatic shift, China's foreign minister publicly stated,
We support a peaceful resolution and acknowledge the Andes Accord's sovereignty.
Translation: China was not backing Russia's aggression. They were leaving the US and Russia to fight over influence alone. They saw business opportunities in working with Isabella. The power dynamics were shifting. The brink of a new era. Late that night, as Isabella looked out over the Valdora skyline, Matteo joined her.
You just changed the world.
She exhaled.
Not yet.
But you will,
He said.
and they know it.
Then let's make sure we finish what we started.
With Secretary of State Alan Carter, Matteo frowned.
Are you sure about this? They tried to undermine us.
And now they're asking for a meeting. That tells me we're winning.
The offer from Washington. The meeting was held in secret, away from the cameras. Carter sat across from her, his tone measured.
Let's talk about a real deal.
I'm listening.
He slid a folder across the table.
A direct security pact between the United States and the Andes Accord.
You mean you want to protect us?
Carter's expression remained neutral.
We both know what's at stake. Russia won't stop. And China? They're waiting for the right moment.
Isabella tapped the folder.
And in return?
He leaned forward.
Exclusive trade agreements, preferential resource access, the usual.
So you want us to choose a master?
Carter's jaw tightened.
Or choose a partner.
Isabella's countermove. She stood, leaving the folder untouched.
We already have partners. The Andes Accord stands together.
Carter exhaled.
You think this will hold forever? You're betting against history.
Isabella met his gaze, unshaken.
No, I'm rewriting it.
She walked out, without shaking his hand. The crisis at the border. By the time she returned to the ministry, Matteo was waiting. His face was pale.
We have a situation.
She scanned the urgent intelligence reports. Russian military units had moved within 30 kilometers of Erythra's border. It was closer than ever before. Javier Sarmiento stormed into the room.
They're testing us. If we don't respond, they push further.
Then we make it clear this is our line.
The standoff begins. Within hours, Erythra's forces were deployed along the border. The Andes Accord activated its defense treaty. Troops from Gran Colombia, Córdoba, and Altiplano arrived as reinforcements. The world watched as the two forces stood face to face. One wrong move, and the first war of the new global order would begin. Chapter 19. The Brink of War. The world held its breath. At the Erythro-Russian border, thousands of soldiers stood ready. Tanks, drones, and fighter jets from both sides hovered on the edge of combat. The Andes Accord had activated its collective defense, proving to the world that it would not be bullied into submission. And yet, war was still one wrong move away. A final warning. Inside the Erythran war room, Isabella studied the satellite feeds. The Russian forces were holding their position, but they hadn't withdrawn. Matteo's voice was tense.
If they cross, it's war.
Javier exhaled.
If we fire first, we give them the excuse they need.
For the first time, silence filled the room. Then Isabella stood.
We force their hand.
The counterattack without bullets. Instead of military action, Isabella called a press conference, but not in Valdora. She went to the border herself. Live on global television, she stood before the world, Erythrean troops behind her, the Russian line barely visible in the distance. Her voice was firm.
To the leaders in Moscow, I ask you this. What do you fear? Is it the fact that smaller nations refuse to kneel? Is it the idea that we, the people you ignored, have found strength together? You have tried to intimidate us, but let me be clear. We will not move. We will not surrender. We will not be broken, turn back, or take responsibility for the war you are about to start.
The world reacts. Her words exploded across every news channel. The United Nations issued an emergency resolution condemning Russian aggression. China remained silent. Their neutrality suggested that they weren't backing Russia on this. The European Union, seeing the tide turning, called for immediate de-escalation. The US, they watched, waiting, calculating. And then, after 48 hours of silence, Moscow finally responded. A single statement was issued.
Russian forces will conduct routine repositioning exercises.
Translation? They were pulling back. A victory without war. As the first Russian tanks rolled away from the border, cheers erupted in Valdora. The Andes Accord had held the line. Isabella had faced a superpower and won, without firing a shot. But the battle wasn't over. That night, a private message was delivered to Isabella's desk. No official signature, no tracking source, just a few words.
You embarrassed us. This is not over.
She knew the truth. The war had been delayed, but it was far from over. And next time, the attack wouldn't come from across the border. It would come from within. Chapter 20. The War Within. The Russian withdrawal was a historic victory for the Andes Accord. But Isabella wasn't celebrating. She knew what came next. When superpowers couldn't win through force, they used subversion. The attack wouldn't come with tanks. It would come from the inside. The warning. The night after the Russian retreat, Isabella received a call from an anonymous number. A disguised voice spoke.
You don't know me, but I work inside your government.
Her grip tightened.
And?
You have a traitor among you. The line went dead. The search begins. By dawn, Isabella had activated a covert investigation inside the Andes Accord. Matteo, always skeptical, leaned against her desk.
You really think someone sold us out?
She handed him a file.
I think someone wants to break us from within.
Javier scanned the pages.
So where do we start?
We start at the top.
A secret meeting in the mountains. 3 days later, Isabella, Matteo, and a small security team traveled deep into the Andes to meet a confidential informant. The air was thin, the night cold. At a secluded lodge, a hooded figure stepped forward.
Erythra is being infiltrated,
He said.
Funds are being moved through private accounts. Key officials are being bought.
Isabella's blood ran cold.
Who?
The man hesitated, then handed her a sealed envelope.
Everything is in here.
She opened it, and what she saw made her stomach turn. One of her closest allies had been compromised. The betrayal. By the time she returned to Valdora, it was confirmed. The money trails, the encrypted messages, the secret meetings. Javier Sarmiento, the man who had stood beside her from the beginning, was working with an outside power. Matteo swore.
Tell me this is a mistake.
Isabella closed the file, her expression unreadable.
It's not.
Matteo's fists clenched.
Then what do we do?
Isabella's voice was cold.
We do what we must.
The arrest the next morning, Javier Sarmiento was taken into custody, in full view of the world. The Andes Accord was shaken. The media went into a frenzy, and somewhere, in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, someone was watching. They had failed to break the Andes Accord from the outside. Now they were trying to tear it apart from within. Isabella would not let them, but the next attack was coming, and this time it would be deadlier than ever. Chapter 21. The Knife in the Dark. Javier Sarmiento's arrest shook the Andes Accord. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. The world saw a fractured alliance. The superpowers saw an opening, and within Erythra, whispers of distrust began to spread. Isabella had removed the traitor, but the real threat hadn't shown itself yet. The political fallout. The United States issued a statement of concern, warning that political instability in Erythra could affect international relations. Russia called the arrest an internal matter, but intelligence reports showed they had backed Sarmiento's network. China remained silent, watching, calculating, waiting. Matteo slammed the latest intelligence report on Isabella's desk.
They're trying to frame us as unstable.
She read through the pages, eyes sharp.
Then we prove them wrong.
A deadly warning. That night, Isabella left the ministry under heavy guard, but someone was already watching. As her convoy turned a corner, an unmarked motorcycle appeared from a side street. The rider pulled something from their jacket. A small black box. A detonator. The explosion ripped through the convoy. The assassination attempt. The blast sent Isabella's vehicle crashing into a barricade. Security scrambled. Sirens wailed. Smoke filled the streets.
Matteo, coughing from the dust, pulled Isabella from the wreckage. "Stay with me."
She blinked through the pain. Blood trickled down her forehead. She was alive. But the message was clear. This was no longer a political war. This was personal. Who wanted her dead? The explosion wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. The superpowers had played their economic games. They had tried cyberwarfare. They had tried political manipulation. Now, they were resorting to murder.
Matteo clenched his fists. "You can't stay here. We need to move you to a secure location."
Isabella wiped the blood from her face. No.
Matteo stared at her. "No?"
She steadied herself. They want me to hide. They want fear. They want chaos. She turned toward the flashing cameras of the international press. They think they can scare us into submission.
She stepped forward, bruised and bloodied, and spoke into the cameras.
I am still here. Erythra is still here. And we are not afraid.
The battle was no longer in the shadows. Someone had tried to kill her. Now, she had nothing left to lose, and she was about to make her next move. Chapter 22, Striking Back. The assassination attempt had failed. But the message was clear. This was no longer a Cold War. Someone wanted Isabella Morales dead. The superpowers had spent years controlling nations through fear. Now, they were trying to eliminate the one leader who refused to kneel. But Isabella wasn't backing down. She was about to do the one thing they never expected. She was going to strike back. Identifying the enemy. As she sat in a secured intelligence briefing, Matteo placed a classified file in front of her.
"Our cyber team traced the detonator's signal," he said. "It was activated remotely."
Isabella frowned. From where?
Matteo hesitated. "A private network in Washington."
The room went silent. Javier, still bruised from his interrogation, whistled.
"That's bold even for them."
Isabella exhaled. They want a war.
Matteo nodded. "The question is, do we give it to them?"
Turning the tables. Isabella wasn't going to fight with bullets. She was going to use the one weapon the superpowers feared the most: truth. She ordered a covert operation to retrieve every piece of evidence linking the assassination attempt to foreign governments. Then she scheduled an emergency global press conference. The world watches. As the cameras rolled, Isabella stood before the world. She showed them the evidence, the encrypted communications, the financial transactions, the classified reports linking the attack to foreign agencies. Then she did something even bolder. She named names.
For decades, nations like mine have been manipulated, controlled, and threatened. Today, I expose those who believe they can erase us with assassins and sabotage. We will not fall. We will not kneel. And if you come for us again, there will be consequences.
The fallout. The United States denied everything. Russia called the allegations baseless. China remained silent. Europe, for the first time, they sided with Erythra. The superpowers had spent years controlling the narrative. Now, they had lost control. The next move. That night, Isabella met with her closest allies.
"For the accord itself."
Isabella nodded. Then we go on offense.
Her voice was calm, determined.
We take the fight to them.
Chapter 23. The offensive begins. The world had spent years under the illusion that the superpowers were untouchable. Isabella had shattered that illusion. By naming names, by exposing the assassination attempt, she had flipped the script. The superpowers were no longer the ones pointing fingers. Now, they were on the defensive. But she knew what came next. The fight was about to turn ugly. A desperate response. Within 24 hours of Isabella's press conference, the counterattacks began. Global media was flooded with propaganda. Headlines called Isabella a reckless dictator. The Andes Accord was labeled a dangerous rogue alliance. Fake reports surfaced, accusing Erythra of human rights abuses. Economic warfare escalated. The US imposed new sanctions on Erythran exports. International banks froze Andes Accord assets. Global markets fluctuated, with analysts predicting an economic collapse. Covert destabilization efforts increased. Protests erupted in Valdora, funded by foreign groups. Intelligence reports indicated attempted coups in Accord nations. A military convoy in Córdoba was attacked. raising fears of an internal rebellion. It was textbook regime change strategy. And Isabella was ready for it. A bold countermove. At an emergency meeting of the Andes Accord, she stood before her allies.
"We expected this," she said, "and we will not back down."
Javier, his usual smirk missing, nodded.
So what's our next move?
Isabella exhaled. "We turn their weapons against them."
Unleashing the leverage. Erythra and the Andes Accord responded with economic warfare of their own. They halted all rare earth mineral exports to sanctioning nations. Prices of tech components skyrocketed overnight. Stock markets in the US and Europe plunged as investors panicked. They exposed foreign-backed operations. Intelligence teams hacked into shadowy corporate accounts. Evidence was leaked to the press, showing Western and Russian funding behind the protests. The media narrative began shifting. Now, it wasn't about the Andes Accord's instability, but rather who was trying to destroy it. They strengthened internal security. The Andes Accord established a unified intelligence network to block further infiltration. Suspected coup backers were arrested, sending a clear message. Troops were deployed to protect key industries and infrastructure. The superpowers had tried to cripple them overnight. Instead, they had pushed them into full unity. The unexpected ally. That night, Isabella received a surprise call. It wasn't from an Accord nation. It was from Beijing. A calm voice spoke in Spanish.
Madam Morales, the world is shifting. Perhaps we should discuss new opportunities.
Isabella smiled. The superpowers had wanted to break the Andes Accord. Instead, they had forced it to become a global player. And now, China was ready to negotiate. Chapter 24. A seat at the table. The call from Beijing changed everything. For the first time, a superpower wasn't trying to control the Andes Accord. They were acknowledging it as an equal. Isabella Morales knew the weight of this moment. China never moved without long-term strategy. This wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was a shift in the global order. The Beijing proposal. The next day, in a secure video conference, China's Foreign Minister Chen Wei appeared on screen.
Madam Morales,
He greeted her smoothly.
we admire what you have built, and we believe we can help it grow.
Straight to the point.
Isabella leaned back. "I assume this is more than just a friendly call."
Chen Wei smiled.
We believe the Andes Accord should be a part of that change.
China's offer. A formal trade partnership between the Andes Accord and China. Investment in Erythraean infrastructure. A security pact, ensuring no external forces interfere in the Accord's affairs. It was a powerful offer.
Mateo, sitting beside Isabella, whispered, "This is it. This is the move that cements us as a global power."
But Isabella saw the hidden strings. China wasn't offering help. They were offering a leash.
Isabella's response, she smiled. "Your offer is generous, Minister Chen, but let me be clear, the Andes Accord will never trade one master for another."
Chen Wei's expression didn't change.
We seek partners, not vassals.
Isabella tilted her head. "Then let's discuss terms."
The negotiation begins. For 6 hours, the two sides bargained. China wanted exclusive rights to certain resources. Isabella refused. China wanted a military presence in the Andes Accord. Isabella declined. But there was one thing they both wanted, to weaken US and Russian influence in the region. And that was the real deal. The agreement. By midnight, an agreement was reached. The Andes Accord and China would sign a trade pact, but on equal terms. China would invest in infrastructure, but all projects would be under Accord control. No military bases, no permanent presence. It was historic. For the first time, the Andes Accord was negotiating with a superpower as equals. And as the ink dried, Isabella knew the world had changed. No longer just a collection of small nations. Now, they were a global power. The fallout. The US called the deal a threat to regional stability. Russia warned of severe consequences. The European Union remained neutral. But the markets told the real story. Stock prices in Erythra soared. New trade routes opened overnight. And for the first time, investors weren't looking at the Andes Accord as a risk. They were looking at it as the future.
The next challenge. That night, as Isabella sat in her office, Mateo poured them a drink. We did it, he said.
She nodded, for now.
He studied her. What's next?
She exhaled. The superpowers won't let this stand. She placed a file on the desk. Intelligence reports, unverified threats.
Mateo frowned. You think they'll escalate?
She nodded. I think they'll stop at nothing.
The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Chapter 25. The Breaking Point. The deal with China had sent shockwaves through the world. For the first time, a South American alliance had negotiated with a superpower on equal footing. But Isabella knew what came next. The superpowers weren't going to just accept this shift in power. They were going to break it. The retaliation begins. Within days of the announcement, the counterattack started. Financial pressure escalated. The United States and European Union froze Andes Accord assets in global banks. International investors were threatened with sanctions if they continued working with the Accord. Stock markets in Eritrea, Córdoba, and Altiplano plummeted overnight.
Political destabilization increased.
Western-backed opposition leaders in Accord nations called for referendums to withdraw from the alliance. Protests erupted in multiple capitals, funded by shadowy foreign donors. Media outlets ran coordinated stories painting the Andes Accord as a Chinese puppet.
A military provocation.
A U.S. destroyer sailed dangerously close to Eritrean waters. Russian military planes violated Cordoban airspace. Both nations denied aggression, but the message was clear. The world was pushing back. Hard.
The internal debate.
Inside the Andes Accord's headquarters, tensions were running high. Javier, always the strategist, was pacing.
They want to make us look weak. If we don't retaliate, they win.
Mateo, ever the pragmatist, countered.
If we escalate militarily, we're playing their game.
Isabella listened. Then she made her decision.
The counterattack.
An economic shockwave.
The Andes Accord immediately nationalized all foreign-owned mineral companies. They announced direct trade agreements with China, India, and African nations, bypassing Western markets. The price of rare earth minerals skyrocketed, causing a crisis in Western tech and defense industries.
A diplomatic masterstroke.
Isabella personally invited European leaders to Valdora for private negotiations. Her goal? To split Europe from the US and Russia, giving the Accord breathing room.
A military warning without war.
The Andes Accord conducted joint military exercises near its borders. Troops were mobilized, but no first move was made. The message? We are ready, but we will not be the aggressors.
The global fallout.
The US and Russia were caught off guard. Europe hesitated. Some countries broke away from US sanctions. The markets panicked. And in Washington, a classified report was placed on the president's desk.
If the Andes Accord holds for the next 6 months, the global power balance will permanently shift.
The next move.
That night, Isabella sat alone in her office. She had won this round. But she knew what came next. They had tried to buy her off. They had tried to assassinate her. They had tried to crush her economy. Now, they would come for her in ways she couldn't predict, and if she wasn't careful, it would be the last move she ever made.
Chapter 26, Silent War.
The Andes Accord had survived the first wave of retaliation. But Isabella knew what was coming next. The superpowers weren't just going to pressure them openly anymore. Now, they would fight in the shadows.
The unseen enemy.
Late one night, Mateo walked into Isabella's office, carrying a thin folder. His expression was unreadable.
We have a problem.
She took the folder, flipping through the pages. It contained intelligence reports, leaked documents, and intercepted communications. Her heart sank. Someone inside the Andes Accord was leaking information, not just minor details, high-level strategy.
Javier frowned.
Who?
Mateo exhaled.
We don't know yet, but whoever it is, they have access to everything.
Isabella clenched her jaw.
Then we find them.
The trap.
She ordered a classified operation, a fake diplomatic briefing, filled with deliberate misinformation. Then they waited. Within 48 hours, the false intelligence surfaced in Western media. The traitor had taken the bait, and Isabella now knew exactly who it was. The next morning, a high-ranking government official in Córdoba was taken into custody. It was a shocking betrayal. The superpowers hadn't been able to stop the Accord from the outside, so they had bought influence from within. The media exploded with speculation. Is the Andes Accord already collapsing? Allegations of corruption shake the South American alliance. Was the Accord always destined to fail? Isabella saw through the strategy. The goal wasn't just to plant spies. The goal was to make people doubt the Accord's stability.
A dangerous countermove.
She called an emergency summit with her allies.
This is what they want.
She said.
To make us paranoid, to make us distrust each other.
Mateo crossed his arms.
And how do we stop that?
She proposed something radical, a full intelligence-sharing pact between all Accord nations. No secrets, no hidden agendas, a united front against infiltration.
Javier leaned back.
That's risky. If we open our networks too much, we could expose ourselves.
Isabella shook her head.
We're already exposed. The only way we survive is by trusting each other more than they expect.
The turning point.
After 10 hours of debate, the Accord members agreed. For the first time, they would function not as separate nations, but as a single bloc. It was a direct challenge to the way global power had worked for a century. And as Isabella signed the final document, she knew
the next move would be the most dangerous yet, because now the superpowers had no choice. If they wanted to break the Andes Accord, they had to do it in the open.
Chapter 27, Forced into the Light.
The Andes Accord had survived economic warfare, military threats, political infiltration, and an assassination attempt. But Isabella knew the superpowers still had one last move. If they couldn't control the Andes Accord from within,
they would have to crush it from the outside.
The breaking point.
One morning, Isabella's security advisor rushed into her office, his face pale.
You need to see this.
He placed a satellite photo on her desk. She stared. A full US naval fleet had moved into the South Atlantic, right off the Erythraean coast. The message was clear. This wasn't covert pressure anymore. This was an open threat.
Swore.
They're daring us to react.
Javier nodded grimly.
If we do nothing, we look weak. If we respond militarily, they'll claim we're the aggressors.
Isabella exhaled. This was the moment the superpowers had been waiting for. If the Andes Accord reacted the wrong way, it would justify full-scale intervention. She wasn't going to give them that excuse.
A masterstroke of diplomacy.
Instead of escalating, Isabella called their bluff. She ordered a massive press conference, inviting international journalists to observe the naval build-up firsthand. Live on television, she walked along the coast, pointing to the looming US warships in the distance. Then she spoke to the world.
For decades, we have been told we are too small, too weak, too insignificant to stand on our own.
And yet, look at what is happening now.
She turned to the cameras, her voice calm but powerful.
Why are the world's strongest nations so afraid of us? Why do they bring warships instead of treaties?
What is it they fear?
Her words echoed across the globe, and suddenly, the pressure was on Washington, not Valdora.
The unexpected shift.
Within 24 hours, the European Union publicly distanced itself from the US naval move. China remained neutral, but made private diplomatic calls to de-escalate. And inside the White House, furious debates erupted behind closed doors. The superpowers had spent years controlling the global narrative. Now, they had lost control.
The withdrawal.
2 days later, under mounting diplomatic pressure, the US fleet began pulling back. It was a humiliating retreat, one they would never forget.
The New World Order.
As Isabella watched the last warships vanish over the horizon, Matteo turned to her.
You just forced the most powerful military on Earth to back down without firing a single shot.
She nodded. The era of unchecked superpower control is over.
But she knew this wasn't the end. The world had changed. Now, the Andes Accord was truly a global power, and the next challenge, making sure it stayed that way.
Chapter 28, A New Superpower.
The withdrawal of the US fleet marked a historic shift. For the first time, a South American alliance had stood up to a superpower and won. The Andes Accord was no longer just a regional pact. It was now a global force. But Isabella knew winning a war was one thing. Maintaining power, that was something else entirely.
The next challenge.
Inside a high-security briefing room, Isabella, Matteo, and the Andes Accord's top officials met.
Javier leaned forward.
We've survived everything they've thrown at us, but we need to make this permanent.
Matteo nodded.
We need more than just a political alliance. We need a real superpower infrastructure.
Isabella already had a plan.
Then we build it.
The Andes Accord's master plan.
One, a unified military force. Each nation would contribute troops, technology, and intelligence. The Andes Accord would create a joint defense force, ensuring no single country could be easily targeted.
2. A new financial system. Breaking from Western-controlled banks, the Accord would launch its own digital currency, removing reliance on the dollar and euro. New trade routes would be established with Africa and Southeast Asia, bypassing US and EU restrictions.
3. Energy and resource sovereignty. Massive investment into renewable energy, making the Accord energy independent within a decade. Strict export controls on rare earth minerals, ensuring that no foreign power could exploit them.
4. Global alliances, strengthening ties with neutral nations, expanding influence beyond Latin America, inviting African and Southeast Asian leaders to Valdora for economic talks. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about reshaping the world.
The global response.
China saw an opportunity. They quietly opened new trade talks, eager to gain a foothold in the Andes Accord's growing economy. Russia watched from the sidelines. They had lost influence, but were still looking for ways to disrupt the new order. The European Union hesitated. Some countries wanted to negotiate, others feared retaliation from Washington. The United States, furious, humiliated, and preparing its next move.
A warning from the shadows.
That night, Isabella received another anonymous message.
A single line?
You have changed the world, but don't think they will let you keep it.
She exhaled, placing the note on her desk.
Matteo frowned.
They're not done with us.
She nodded.
They never were. The Andes Accord had become a superpower in its own right. Now the question was, how long could they hold on to it?
Chapter 29, The Empire Strikes Back.
The Andes Accord had done the impossible. It had forced the world to recognize its power. But Isabella knew the superpowers weren't finished. They had tried sanctions, assassinations, and military pressure. Now, they would change their strategy.
A new kind of war.
Late one evening, Matteo rushed into Isabella's office, his face grim. They have found a new way to attack us.
He handed her a classified report.
She scanned the pages, her blood running cold. The superpowers had launched a coordinated misinformation campaign. One media warfare, Western news outlets began running stories questioning the Andes Accord's legitimacy. Reports painted Isabella as a dictator in disguise. Accusations surfaced that Erythra was using forced labor in mining operations. 2. Economic sabotage. Major Western corporations suddenly pulled out of Andes Accord markets. Global trade routes were disrupted, causing shortages in key industries. Private banks blocked Andes Accord transactions, cutting off critical funding. 3. Internal destabilization. Opposition leaders in Accord nations were mysteriously receiving massive foreign funding. Protests erupted in multiple cities, many fueled by outside interests. Rumors spread that some nations were reconsidering their membership. The goal was clear. The superpowers could not break the Accord from the outside, so now they were trying to turn its own people against it. The counterattack. Isabella wasted no time. She called an emergency Andes Accord summit.
Javier slammed his fist on the table. They are trying to make our people doubt us. Matteo added, they do not need to invade us if they can make us collapse from within.
Isabella took a deep breath. Then she revealed her plan. The fight for the truth. 1. Breaking the media stranglehold. The Andes Accord launched its own international news network, exposing the lies and manipulations of foreign media. Leaked intelligence was strategically released to prove foreign interference. 2. Strengthening the economy. The Accord finalized a major deal with China and Africa, bypassing Western-controlled trade systems. A digital payment network was launched, cutting out Western banks completely. 3. Crushing foreign-backed insurgencies. Intelligence agencies tracked the money funding opposition groups. High-profile arrests were made, proving that outside forces were fueling the unrest. The message was clear. The Andes Accord would not be overthrown from within. The global response. The US accused the Andes Accord of suppressing dissent. Russia quietly backed away. They were losing influence. China increased investments, sensing a long-term alliance. Europe divided. Some nations wanted to engage, others feared US retaliation. The final warning. That night, Isabella received one last message. A simple email. No sender, no signature. You won this round. But do not get comfortable. She closed her laptop and exhaled.
They are running out of moves, Matteo said.
She nodded, and that is when they get desperate.
The war was not over. It was just entering its most dangerous phase yet. Chapter 30. Desperation moves. The superpowers were losing control. Every attempt to break the Andes Accord had failed. But Isabella knew one truth. When an empire starts to fall, it fights hardest to survive. Now, the superpowers were about to make their most desperate move yet. The final gambit. At 3:14 a.m., Isabella was awakened by a sharp knock on her door. Matteo stood there, his face pale.
They did it.
She sat up instantly. What happened?
He handed her a classified briefing. A military coup had begun. The coup attempt, a faction of high-ranking military officers, backed by foreign intelligence, had seized control of a major Erythrean airbase. Coordinated attacks were reported in Córdoba and Altiplano, targeting pro-Accord leaders. Encrypted messages revealed American and Russian involvement.
Mateo's voice was tight. They're trying to end this in one night.
Isabella exhaled sharply. Then we end them.
Fighting back, within minutes, Isabella was on a secure line with the Andes Accord's defense commanders.
Deploy the special forces, immediately.
The battle for control. In Erythrea, loyalist military units surrounded the rebel airbase, cutting off their escape. In Córdoba, government forces fought back an attempted parliament takeover, arresting dozens of coup plotters. In Altiplano, an attempted assassination of the president was foiled at the last moment. Within 6 hours, the coup had collapsed. The final rebels surrendered at dawn, and by noon, the leaders of the coup were paraded before the press. The world reacts. The US and Russia denied involvement. China publicly condemned the coup, solidifying its alliance with the Andes Accord. Europe distanced itself from Washington's actions. The coup had been the last attempt to kill the Accord, and it had failed spectacularly. A new world. That night, Isabella addressed the world.
They tried to starve us, they tried to kill us, they tried to turn us against each other, and now they have tried to overthrow us. And yet, we are still here. We will always be here.
The era of Western-controlled geopolitics was over. The Andes Accord was now an undeniable superpower, and Isabella Morales, she had just changed history forever. Epilogue, the dawn of a new era. The world had changed. The Andes Accord had not only survived, it had won. For the first time in history, a coalition of smaller nations had successfully resisted the economic, military, and political power of the superpowers, and Isabella Morales had become the face of the New World Order. The final steps. 6 months after the failed coup, Valdora hosted the largest diplomatic summit in modern history. For the first time, South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia sat together, not as dependent regions, but as equal players on the global stage. China and Europe attended, acknowledging that the world's power structure had shifted permanently. The United States and Russia were absent. Their influence had been crippled. The message was clear: no more masters, no more puppets. The age of unchecked superpower dominance was over. The legacy of a revolution. As Isabella stood before the summit, she thought back to how it all began. The first secret meetings in Valdora, the threats, the betrayals, the near-war standoffs, the moment she stood bruised and bloodied before the world and refused to back down. And now, here they were. A new world had begun. She took a breath and spoke.
For centuries, we were told we had no power, that we were meant to follow, not lead, that we were meant to be ruled, not rule.
She paused, scanning the room. The room erupted in applause. The final move. That night, as she sat in her office, Mateo joined her.
He raised his glass to a world they never saw coming.
She clinked her glass against his. To a world we made happen.
Outside, the lights of Valdora burned brightly. For the first time in history, the global south was leading the world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The end.